Greeting Markham artists. Let's get started on some different watercolor techniques. We're going to do 4 different watercolor techniques in a demonstration. The first one will be wet paint on dry paper, watercolor paper. The next one will be wet watercolor on wet paper. Third will be graduated wash, and finally a variegated wash. So let's start. Watercolor sets. So watercolor sets are in all different degrees of neatness. Truthfully, they go a long while with a tiny bit left. I'm going to use this set. The super messy set is my favorite. The first section I'm going to try is the wet on wet. Wet on wet. Oh, excuse me, wet on dry. Wet on dry. So I'm going to choose one color because I get one color. I'm going to scoop up that color, and I'm going to get my brush kind of filled up with that color, and I'm going to paint that section in. When you're painting your piece, you do not have to fill the whole thing. If you want to make kind of a design through it, you can. Okay, so when you're using the wet paint on dry paper, you can get a very precise line with watercolor. Get it nice and neat and precise. Next section is wet on wet. I'm going to take a wet paintbrush without paint on it, and I'm going to wet that section of the box. Then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get myself some color. Now this time the color will come out lighter because my paper is wet, and it's also going to spread kind of quickly. I have a little bit less control, but I do get a really cool varied edge for that one. That is a wet on wet technique. Next one is a graduated wash. I'm going to wet the paper again. I'm going to wet neatly within my little space here. Now I'm going to graduate the wash. It's going to change from color to color. I'm going to pick up my red again. I'm taking my brush and I'm getting it loaded with red, and this time I'm only going to paint the top. And when I paint the top, it will simply drip down into the bottom. I'll paint one side and just the top, and then I'm just going to let the watercolor spread totally on its own. The last section is the variegated wash. Now again, you only get one color, but this is one of my favorite watercolor techniques. I'm going to wet my whole little square. Then I'm going to take my color. I'm going to make sure I get my brush loaded with lots of color. Now I'm going to pretend that this brush is a lightning bolt, and I can only just zap it quickly. I'm going to put my brush straight up and down and just touch, and watch as it creates kind of like lightning bolts as it drifts out into the water. Now if I were to keep going and keep going, eventually it would just look like a wet on wet or a wet on dry, but if I leave it like that, it'll stay kind of polka dotted, and then within there I can pull it if I'd like. So there are your 4 watercolor techniques. Wet watercolor on dry paper, wet watercolor on paper that I pre-wet, a graduated wash, which I pre-wet my little section by just painting water on top, and then I added watercolor on just 2 sides. You could do one side and let it run down. You can even tip it. And then another one is the variegated wash. For my mantra, I'm going to try out the gradiated wash. So I'm going to paint my whole mantra with just water, and then I'm going to pull up some purple, and I'm just going to paint the top with purple. And let it drip. Drip down. There you go. Your mantra, watercolor painted.